a video stream going separate, just focused on me. So I'm not recording all of what's happening here in the Google Meet, but I am recording for sort of a YouTube video as a backup if you need to go back and listen to some of this, or if for some reason we don't have everybody. I think we're close to having everybody at this point. We might be missing one maybe, but that way you can go back and take a look at the video recorded from what we do here in class. Where we've left off, I've got us at a point where we've talked our way through, or you've listened to me talk our way through what's going on in the missionary trips, as far as where he goes and when and what that looks like for what's happening in the text of the book of Acts. And that leaves us now with the end of missionary journey number 3 and the beginning of what we consider his final trip, his imprisonment journey. It's his 4th trek across the Roman world, but it's not a missionary trip per se. He's not free to come and go and do whatever he wants. He's a prisoner at this point, and so he's on his way to Rome, and sort of strategically on his way to Rome. He intended to go to Rome because he wants an audience with the emperor. One, he wants his case to be heard. He thinks it's going to get dismissed, it seems. And second, he wants the opportunity, if he is going to be in prison, to at least preach the gospel to the Roman emperor while he's got sort of a captive audience, so to speak. And that's where we're going to pick up. Okay, so you need the Bible open to Acts. Okay, let's go to chapter 23. Okay, well, the end of chapter 22. So open up to Acts 22. That's where we're going to pick up. I'm going to walk you through some of the plot line and the storyline here, and then we're going to look at a couple of events that happen on his final trip journey, talk through the end of where Acts leaves us off as far as history is concerned, and then set that in some framework so that we understand a bit of what's happening with a large portion of our New Testament writings. Because Paul does so much of the writing that we have for the New Testament, understanding his life context and what perhaps the end of that life looks like a bit, gives us some shape to the letters and the timeline and how that all sort of plays itself out. So we're in Acts 22, okay, and we are going to pick up in verse 25. So 22-25, here's what's happened to this point. Paul has finished his 3rd missionary trip, and as he promised, he took a collection back to Jerusalem for the church that's there. In addition to taking that collection, he took a group of individuals that had been traveling with him and has visited the temple. It's during his visit to the temple that a group of individuals from Asia who've traveled to Jerusalem as well, probably for a feast or festival, have recognized Paul, and they're not exactly fans. So that group of individuals that has caused Paul problems in Asia and in Macedonia and in a handful of these other places has now landed itself in Jerusalem, and Paul is visiting the temple with a few of his Gentile converts to Christianity. And they recognize him and start to create a bit of a fuss. Actually, they create a huge fuss. They accuse Paul of teaching things contrary to the scriptures, which isn't necessarily true, but they consider him to be a bit of a blasphemer, a lot like he considered Christians when he was a Pharisee before his conversion in Acts chapter 9, right? And so they start throwing these accusations around, and a mob forms basically, and the temple guards come down and the high priest and the authorities and whatever, and he ends up getting arrested. So Paul is now arrested, and he's given a defense before the council, And that's not satisfied anybody. Everybody's still angry with him. And they're starting to call for his punishment, right? They want him taken to prison. They want him to be beaten and whipped and all of this other. And so a group of Roman soldiers and the tribune, who is in command of those soldiers, sort of take custody of Paul. And they're about to flog him, right? Like they did Jesus in his crucifixion event. So he's about to get 39 lashes. And in verse 25 of Acts 22, it says this: "But when they had stretched him out for the whips, Paul said to the centurion who's standing by, 'Is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned?'" He hasn't stood proper trial. So there's been no conviction. No Roman authority has convicted him of anything. And so now he sort of tosses out the citizenship card. Wait, hold on. You're about to do this to a Roman citizen. So then 26, when the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said to him, "What are you about to do? This man is a Roman citizen." So the tribune came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" Paul said, "Yes." And the tribune answered, "I bought this citizenship for a large sum of money." The tribune here is in disbelief. So there were a couple of ways you could become a citizen of the Roman Empire. You could be born into it, or you could serve in the Roman military somehow and purchase your citizenship. Okay. And so this is what the tribune has done. And Paul said to him, "I'm a citizen by birth." And so those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately. And the tribune was afraid because he realized Paul was a Roman citizen and he had bound him. So he's not supposed to do this. So then Paul is going to be taken back and stand trial formally before the council. The council is going to condemn him. And then there's a Jewish plot to kill him. He's rescued from that by this tribune. And then he's taken to the Roman governor Felix in verse 23 of Acts chapter 23. So 23, he's taken to Felix, the Roman governor. Okay. He's given a full-on guard to protect him from Jerusalem to Caesarea Philippi on his journey. And then he stands trial before Felix. Felix delays and delays and delays and delays. He's not wanting to pronounce any kind of verdict on this. And so finally, when he's sort of forced to make a decision, and Paul recognizes that the decision isn't going to go in his favor because the Jews are reacting so negatively, he just appeals to Caesar to circumvent Felix's judgment. Paul realizes that with the pressure mounting from Jewish authority and Jewish leadership, that the verdict Felix passes isn't necessarily going to be a just verdict. It's going to be a verdict to keep the Jews quiet and from revolting. And that means that Paul's going to be the one who ends up dead, even though he's not necessarily convicted of anything, or even though he shouldn't be convicted of anything. And so to circumvent what Felix is about to go ahead and do, Paul just appeals to the emperor anyway. Okay. He's taken before Agrippa. And then in chapter 27, he's actually going to be taken to Rome. And so now we're moving to chapter 27. His trip we outlined yesterday. Okay. However, I want to go to 27. Let's go to 27:39. 27:39. So he has set sail from the island of Crete on his fourth trip, and he is on his way to Malta. Now, there's a handful of things that have gone on here. Paul has warned them, now's not the right time to sail from Crete to Malta. Bad stuff's going to happen. We're going to end up shipwrecked. And then sure enough, bad stuff happens and they end up shipwrecked. Go figure. So 27:39, here's what it says. Now, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders, hoisting the foresail. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground, and the bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern being broken up by the surf. So now they've run the ship into a place where it's just going to be broken up into bits. Okay, so in verse 42, The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that nobody can escape. Well, let's just guarantee that nobody escapes, because if they escape, we're going to be the ones that end up dead. So we're just going to kill everybody, and then the prisoners are stuck. They're prisoners anyway, who cares? However, there's a centurion on board who wants to save Paul, and he kept them from carrying out their plan and ordered those who could swim to jump overboard and make for land. The rest they set on planks or on pieces of the ship, and so all were brought safely to the shore. So now we're at the beginning of chapter 28. They've been shipwrecked. It's a mess. Nobody likes to listen to the Apostle Paul on this particular trip, even though he's been right every time he's spoken up. So now they learn in verse 1 of chapter 28 that they're on the island called Malta. Here's what it says, verse 2. The native people showed unusual kindness, and they kindled a fire and welcomed us all, because it had begun to rain and it was cold. So when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened onto his hand. Paul has gathered a group of sticks to continue the fire, and among those sticks is a poisonous snake. As he goes to place the wood on the fire, the snake comes out of the wood and bites him on the hand. So verse 4, when the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, no doubt this man is a murderer. Here's the catch. They're right. This is exactly what Paul was doing prior to Acts chapter 9 in his conversion to Christianity. Persecuting the church, approving of the stoning of Stephen. And so the natives here on Malta have gathered something sort of astutely. Paul's been bitten by a snake, and so obviously he's done something terrible, and their conclusion is that he's a murderer. They go on, though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. They believe that this is sort of the just recompense of Paul's past. He is a prisoner after all, and so they're reading into the situation. Verse 5, he, however, shook the creature off into the fire, and he suffered no harm. Paul seems to be just fine. Verse 6, they were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But when they had waited a long time and they saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. It's from one extreme to the other extreme. Snake's bitten him on the hand, so clearly has to be a murderer. He's done something horrifically bad, and this is sort of justice finding him out. This is the gods punishing him for whatever his past actions are. However, nothing happens to him. And so then their obvious conclusion is, well, okay, I guess he's not, a murderer. Maybe he's just God. So then, Paul visits a neighborhood and he heals some individuals. In verse 9, when the rest of the people on the island who had diseases came and were cured, they honored us greatly, and when we were about to set sail, they put on board whatever we needed. So here's the deal. Paul has made this trip, and even though he's a prisoner here, bound, shipwrecked, been bitten by a poisonous snake, every opportunity he has to teach, to pray over, care for those who need it, he's taken that opportunity. The story here in 28 highlights so much for us that has transpired from the beginning of Paul's life as a Christian in Acts chapter 9. Because when we started the story of the life of Saul, who is Paul, he's part of a group that's stoning Stephen for Stephen's Christian faith. In Acts chapter 7 and the beginning of chapter 8. And then in chapter 9, he has this conversion experience, which we're going to talk about in tomorrow's video. And that sets him on the course of his whole life, and it's all summed up for us in this encounter on Malta. Bitten by a snake, got to be a murderer. Well, yeah, that was true of his former life. Well, maybe he's a god. No, not quite that. But then he goes about preaching and teaching, and he goes about healing the sick and praying over them. The story of Acts 28 is sort of the story of the life of Paul in this microcosm. Here's the deal then. He will leave the island of Malta, provided for like he has been provided for on all of his missionary trips, and set sail to live in Rome and await his trial. Okay? So then, here's where the book of Acts ends. Paul's in prison in Rome, awaiting his audience with the emperor. That's it. Paul has told us 100 times in various places and spaces how many things he's wished to do and places he's wished to go. He even mentioned in the book of Romans, as he's writing a letter to the church that he hasn't met yet, that he wishes to go to see them and then be sent along by them so that he can go on to Spain. And so now he's got his chance. He's in the city of Rome. He can meet the church, kind of. I mean, he's a prisoner. It's all sort of culminated to this moment, and then the book of Acts just sort of ends. Doesn't seem like it's finished. So here's the deal. There are two options for the end of the life of the Apostle Paul, because Acts doesn't tell us. What we can discern from where Acts ends and what is happening in the history around Paul and his ministry, Acts ends sometime around 62 or 63. The year 62 or 63. Paul is a prisoner in Rome, which probably means he's got some sort of lodging as a Roman citizen. He's probably not like in a dungeon or some sort of prison cell someplace. He's got some kind of lodging. He might have a little apartment or something like that. He's not necessarily free to come and go and do everything that he wishes, but he's not confined to a 10 by 10 cell either. He can probably go to the market and get groceries, although he'll have a buddy. A Roman soldier will be with him at all times. He can have visitors, probably, with his little Roman soldier buddy with them all the time. Okay. And he's free to write letters and to discuss matters and fill in the blank. So he's not locked up, but he's not free necessarily either. Okay, and so there's a bit of tension here. Why do we think Acts ends sometime 62 or 63 before things sort of turn in the Roman world? Because the emperor at the time, or the soon-to-be emperor in 63, I think it's the emperor at the time, will be Emperor Nero. Okay, we know Nero from history. We don't like Nero. He's a bit of a cuckoo. Legitimately crazy, I think. In 63, 64, early in 64, Nero is going to set fire to the city of Rome on purpose. And while parts of the city of Rome burn to the ground, Nero sits on his roof and plays his fiddle. Okay? Following the fire in Rome, Nero blames the Christians. Everybody knows that Nero's done it. He set the city on fire, and yet he blames the Christians and then goes about systematically persecuting them and having them executed. So this is where things like Christians in the Colosseum and mass crucifixions and beheadings of Roman Christians and things like that really start to take place. And this persecution is a first very serious wave of intentional, we don't like the Christians, so we're just going to kill as many of you as we can in a single rush. Nero uses the fire to justify his destruction of Christians in and around the city of Rome. Okay. That takes place sometime in 64. Okay. Among that very serious wave of persecution seems to be the death of like the Apostle Peter. Okay. So Peter dies somewhere 64, maybe 65, under this very intense wave of persecution from Nero. So our first option for the end of Paul's life is that it's going to be pretty close to that of the end of Peter's life, somewhere 64. Okay. If that's the case, then that means every letter that Paul writes from Romans through to perhaps even the Hebrews text, if he is the author of the Hebrews text, something we're going to have to talk about as we do the New Testament stuff. All of Paul's letters, 13 or 14, depending on how you count Hebrews, are written before 64. Okay, so that's option number one. Option number two is that somehow Paul is released prior to the what we call the Neronic or the Nero persecutions. And he actually goes to Spain and he spends a bunch of time there, and then he'll get rearrested by Roman authorities this time for preaching the gospel based on his missionary work in places like Spain. And his execution will be sometime around the year 67. Those are your two options. Okay. I am of the opinion Paul's death is probably under the persecutions of Nero, and he dies in 64. Okay. Very close to the death of the Apostle Peter. All right. And so Acts ends for us in late 62, maybe the very beginning of 63. And I think it does because I think it's pretty clear that Paul is not going to be set free, especially with somebody like Nero in charge. Okay, so that means this. Paul's first letter is probably somewhere between 48 and 50. Perhaps the Galatians letter, right? If it's not Galatians, then his first letters are right around the year 50 or 51, and it's the Thessalonian letters. And Galatians follows behind it in the same year. Okay, so those are our first three. Galatians and the two Thessalonian letters are the first three letters that the Apostle Paul writes, and that's somewhere around 48. Let's just hypothetically go with 48. Okay. So then the remaining 10 or 11 letters Paul writes over the span of the next sort of 14 years, 15 years by the time he gets to 63. And that's just the letters that we have. So for example, we know in our New Testament, there are two Corinthian letters, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. There's actually a letter written in between the two that we don't have. It's been lost. History and time and conquerings and whatevers have destroyed it or buried it, and we can't find it. So we currently know that Paul wrote at least 3 letters to the Corinthian church, perhaps 4, and we only have 2 of them. What are the chances he wrote multiple letters to the church at Ephesus? What are the chances he wrote multiple letters to places like Philippi? Or wrote more than 2 letters to the church in Thessalonica? Did he ever write to the city of Athens and the church that was there? Chances are Paul wrote a great deal more than we actually have, and history has just destroyed it. But because of the role of the Holy Spirit and God's preservation of the text, these are the things that we have. Okay? So here's what we've got. The Apostle Paul begins his life as a Pharisee, persecuting the church. In Acts chapter 9, that whole thing switches. And he will then spend the rest of his life dedicated to the gospel and planting churches and bringing the truth of the gospel to the world around him especially to Gentile communities as much as he possibly can. And so from Acts chapter 9 to Acts chapter 28, that's the story that we get pretty consistently. From that conversion moment till the mid-60s, 64, maybe 67, Paul's going to spend his life dedicated to the advancement of the gospel. Going by Saul as a Pharisee, and then going by Paul as an apostle to the Gentiles. His name given by his family is Saul. It's a Hebrew name, right? Like King Saul from the First Testament texts and stories. But in a Greek context, he goes by the name Paul. And this is one of those sort of popular misconceptions that we can dispel a little bit. We don't see God change his name. It's not like an Abram to Abraham thing where God has changed his name. It's not a Jacob to Israel thing where God has changed his name. It's quite simply that he goes by Paul in a Roman or Greek Gentile sort of context. It's sort of a Hellenizing of the name Saul. Okay? But there's no place in our scripture that tell us God changed his name. Okay? Luke, the author of Acts, just tells us Saul, who was also called Paul, and then starts calling him Paul as he moves on to these Gentile missions trips to convert the Greek-speaking world to faith in Christ. Okay. Paul, let's just think about this for a second then. In the course of that lifetime, in about 15 years, right? And in his writing and in his ministry, has composed for us at least 13, if not 14 texts in our New Testament. Guys, the New Testament only has 27 texts in it. That means Paul's roughly responsible for 50% of the New Testament that you read. Half, maybe a little over. We can say half, right? If it's 13, it's just a little under half. If it's 14, it's over half. 13 or 14, so half of the New Testament comes to us from one individual and his ministry team and partners because of what happens to him in Acts chapter 9. Again, we're going to talk about that tomorrow, but I want you to think about that. Half of your New Testament comes to you from the life and ministry of the Apostle Paul. There's a great deal of treasure in that, and there's a great deal of risk, especially for us. So here's our tendency, especially as Protestants. Our tendency is to emphasize what Paul writes because most of what we read in the New Testament is the Apostle Paul. And that does us a great deal of good. We get to see a full development of what the gospel looks like according to Paul. We get to see him communicate it to various people in various ways at various times across the board. And it's good, and it's healthy, and it's vibrant, and it's a lot deeper than we tend to think. Okay, and so we need to pay attention. And one of the things that we're going to do as we read through the letters of Paul is pay attention to how he continues to go back and talk about the same sets of ideas in multiple letters, but in different ways. Or how, regardless of what he's doing in each of his letters, he keeps coming back to consistent refrains and themes and movements of the gospel and of the Christian life. It's a treasure to be mined for a great deal of good in the Christian life. However, because we have so much from Paul, our tendency is to overemphasize Paul and not emphasize letters like the Peter letters, the John letters, the gospel texts even. So much of our time as Christians is spent reading stories and reading Paul that we miss a lot of really good material that's in the rest of our New Testament. And so it's sort of a two-edged sword there. We need to be careful about that. Okay? So here's where that leaves us. Just so we're clear. You've got some background now, right? Paul's life in 15 years, in about a 10-year span leading up to his arrest. From his first missionary trip to his arrest, of where he goes and what he does in planning these churches. And we're going to overlay that as we get into the New Testament here pretty quickly with what he writes and when he writes it, to whom he writes it, and from where he writes it on this journey and this trip. So you've got sort of a foundation now to start looking at the rest of the New Testament through. Okay. Questions, concerns? Good. Okay. Tomorrow, right? So I'll post the sort of video recap from this to Power School so you guys can see it if you need to, or if somebody misses it or whatever. And then you'll see something for tomorrow morning, right? Each of my content blocks will get dated. So whatever is for today will be dated with 11/17, and stuff for tomorrow will be dated 11/18. Do them at whatever pace your schedule allows. Okay. The goal is you're here live when we are live, and catching those videos when we're not. Thursday, the game plan is to be live. Okay. There is a chance